Hey, what's going on YouTube? USMT Saxoki here. In my last video I went over mutual funds and ETFs and how you should focus on the underlying fees that are being charged on those mutual funds and ETFs rather than the performance of them, because overall if those ETFs and mutual funds are heavily invested in stocks, the performance is going to be similar over time based on the market. So digging into fees more, there's one fee that I don't understand, and that's the expense ratio. That's a fee that's charged on all mutual funds and ETFs, and I just don't understand it, because when you look at your statements, you look at your funds, there's no visible, transparent deduction for that expense ratio. So instead of just saying, who cares, it's probably not a big deal, I thought, well, I'm gonna ask Vanguard specifically, hey, where is this expense taken out of my funds? And the answer I got from them was both confusing and it did kind of answer my question. So let's go ahead and look at that, what they said. So I invested with Vanguard because they have one of the lowest expense ratios and fees in the industry, but they still have fees, they still have expenses. So this is taken from Yahoo Finance again, and this is one of the funds I have with Vanguard, and it just shows you the different expenses and fees. So the annual expense report expense ratio, which I was talking about before, 0.15%. Prospectus net expense ratio, 0.15. Prospectus gross expense ratio, 0.15. Those don't show up on Vanguard's website, and I'll show you in a second. It just says expense ratio 0.15. And there's no 12B1 fee, there's no front-end sales load, there's no max deferred sales load, and then it gives you your projected expenses. So I'm logged on to my Vanguard account here, and the VFIFX, the Vanguard Target Retirement 2050 Fund, is the fund that I just looked at on Yahoo Finance. And as you can see, the expense ratio, like it said on Yahoo Finance, is 0.15%. So what does that mean? And I asked Vanguard through their messaging, and this is the reply I got. Now with Vanguard, yes, of course I could have called and talked to somebody, but I find that for me especially, it's easier to write everything out. So this is what I asked them. All right, so the subject was expense ratios, and I wrote, where and when are the expense ratios taken out of my funds? What I mean is that when I buy or sell stocks, the $7 commission fee is very transparent, and I know I'm paying it as part of the transaction. I've never seen a deduction of my accounts from the expense ratio fees for my VFIFX and VOO funds. Where does this show up? Where are these fees taken from? Is it once a year, quarter, or every month? I know Vanguard has some of the industry's lowest fees, so please don't explain that to me. That's why I invest with Vanguard. I just need some transparency. Thanks. Okay, so this is their first response. Thank you for taking the time to contact us. When you invest in a mutual fund, you pay a proportionate amount of the fund's operating costs and management expenses through the expense ratio. Okay, got that. The expense ratio is expressed as a percentage of total assets. For example, if you invest in a fund with an expense ratio of 0.1%, you'll pay $1 for every $1,000 you invest. Okay, this figure doesn't include any loads or purchase or redemption fees that a fund may charge, which most Vanguard mutual funds do not. The expense ratio reduces the return of the fund before it reaches your account. It's not deducted from your account balance. Okay, so that answers that question. So that's why I don't see any specific deductions for this fee on my account balance, but I was still confused about a lot of things. Okay, so I wasn't really satisfied with that answer because I wanted more specifics. I wanted to know, hey, how much am I actually paying? Where's this money, where's it taken from? How much am I losing? So I said, okay, what do you mean by reduces the return of the fund before it reaches your account? Is this a reduction in the dividend payments paid out quarterly and yearly? Is this a once a year fee? If I have $70,000 in a fund, which is about what I have, with a 0.15% expense ratio, which is what it is, does that mean I pay $105 once a year every quarter, or some other interval? Thank you. Now, side note on this, I 100% am okay with paying $105 a year on the money I have invested. I understand that people that work for Vanguard, they gotta get paid, they gotta eat, they got a family to feed, whatever. That's fine. I understand that every mutual fund, every ETF, there are going to be fees. What I'm concerned about is paying the lowest amount possible on my money that makes money. Okay, so this was their response to that one. Thank you for taking the time to contact us. Got it. When you invest in a mutual fund, you pay a proportion amount of the fund's operating costs, management expenses, to the expense ratio. Okay, so in that first paragraph, they reiterate what they already said. Okay, then expense ratios are taken on the fund level, not on the shareholder level. Okay, that's confusing. Therefore, there is not a figure to represent fund expenses paid by an individual. As an example, funds that accrue earnings on a daily basis have the day's expenses deducted from the day's earnings. Okay, the result is that each month the accrued dividends that are paid out are net of expenses. Funds that do not accrue earnings daily have their expenses deducted from the fund net asset value. Vanguards, this is where it gets even more confusing. Vanguard's fund of funds don't charge their own separate expenses. Instead, they take a weighted average of the expense ratios of their underlying funds. This figure is expressed as the fund's acquired fund fees and expenses. So to me, that's like, am I paying fund fees on top of fees on top of fees? Because like this specific Vanguard fund that I'm in is composed of other Vanguard funds. So, you know, that's like a red flag right there. And then finally, the expense ratio reported for a fund typically reflects expenses incurred by the fund during its most recent ended fiscal year. However, future expenses can be higher or lower than the previous year. Okay, so a couple things that I took from this is that the fees are deducted from dividends that are paid. So it's not like if the fund goes up in value, the fee is taken away from the percentage that went up in value. It just means that what I take from this is that every quarter, if there's dividends that are paid, and at the end of the year, dividends that are paid, the operating cost, the expense ratio is taken out of those dividends. Then eventually I was just like, can you just tell me how much I spend on this expense ratio? So I said, could you please show me roughly how much I've spent in expense ratio fees for my Vanguard accounts? This response was confusing, especially when we talk about funds of funds and weighted averages of the underlying funds. To me, this sounds like fees on fees. I'm not trying to be negative. I just want to, sorry about that. I just want to understand this so I can inform other investors that may not be privy to underlying fees of their nest eggs. This is the last response from Vanguard. Thank you for following up with us about expense ratios. I sincerely apologize for any confusion resulting from the information provided about expense ratios, and I'll be happy to provide clarification. The listed expense ratio for a fund is the amount needed to cover that fund's operating costs and management expenses. Got that. Since this amount is not deducted from your account balance, there is not a report listing the total amount paid towards the expense ratio for any fund you have invested in. Instead, the expense ratio reduces the return of the fund before the returns reach your account. Okay. Additionally, regarding the expense ratios for funds of funds, it is first important to note what a fund of fund is. Vanguard funds of funds are mutual funds whose underlying investments are comprised of other Vanguard mutual funds. Yes, got that. In this case, because the underlying funds have their own expense ratios, there is not an expense ratio for the fund of funds. Instead, there is a figure called acquired fund fees and expenses, which is a weighted average of the expense ratios of the underlying funds. Okay, confusing. This does not mean you are being charged multiple fees. Okay, that's good. It simply means that because you are indirectly invested in various Vanguard mutual funds through a fund of funds, the operating costs are covered through the acquired fund fees and expenses figure, which I assume to be the expense ratio. You can review more information about expense ratios for mutual funds and ETFs here. So then down at the very bottom there's a link, and I went there. So this is that link from Vanguard. Expense ratios, what are they and how they work? You won't find them on an account statement. Okay, the cost of investing is usually associated with trading commissions and account service fees, items you see as debits from your accounts, correct. But expense ratios are less obvious because they're not itemized in your account statements or confirmations. Instead, each fund's expenses are deducted from its total value on a regular basis, and those expenses cut directly into your investment returns. The nitty-gritty of what an expense ratio is. An expense ratio reflects how much a mutual fund or an ETF pays for portfolio management, administration, marketing, and distribution, among other expenses. You almost always see it expressed as a percentage of the fund's average net assets. For example, okay, and it just says how much cheaper Vanguard it is to invest with Vanguard. How expense ratios are calculated at Vanguard. Let me adjust this. Made it worse. Okay. As each fund passes its fiscal year end, the annual expense ratio is calculated by dividing the fund's operating expenses by its average net assets. If the fund's assets are increasing faster than its cost, you'll enjoy lower expenses as a fund shareholder. Okay. So after reading all that, I think I have a pretty good idea of where that money is taken out of. And so I said, thank you. It sounds like any expenses associated with my funds are simply deducted from dividends or earnings of the funds before they are distributed to the fund holder. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means that every quarter and at the end of the year, when I get to share in some of the profits from that fund, those expenses are just deducted from the entire fund and then divvied out based on how many shares you own. So for example, at the end of the year, I usually get around $1,200 to $1,500 as income from that fund, and I imagine that that expense ratio, based on a number of different factors, they subtract a certain amount from that before they pay me. So that's where those come from. So what's the bottom line? What's the point? If you live in the E and S quadrants, Robert Kiyosaki, Rich Dad, Poor Dad, you don't know what that is, and you're an employee or you're a small business owner or you own your own business and you're investing for your retirement for the future and you invest in the stock market, mutual funds, ETFs, it's important to figure out what the fees are, what you're being charged, and make sure those are the lowest possible, because for the average investor, performance over time is going to be the same, very much so across the market. So that's the point of this video. If you're an average investor and you're putting money in a Roth IRA, ETFs, you want to make sure that the fees, expense ratio, the upfront sales load to be zero first of all, but minimum as possible, okay? Because those fees eat into your earnings and eat into your dividends, and over time, those add up to thousands of dollars. Okay, bonus time. If you remember, or if you watch, you know my channel, you watch some videos of mine that I made. I made a video a while back about how lawns are a huge liability and all they do is suck money, energy, and they don't provide hardly any benefit. Okay, so this year I've spent a total of $90 on cutting my grass, maintaining my lawn. Okay, well, plus maybe like $5 in electricity to run my electric weed whipper. So I spent $90 all summer to maintain my lawn. I think that's pretty good, and it looks fine. Okay, that's gonna wrap it up for today. USMC Sachs Oki, live smarter, live simpler, live with more money, invest smarter, invest simpler, invest and make more money. USMC Sachs Oki, I will see you next time. Thanks for watching.